Hello, Muslim friends in the world. Autumn skies cloaked the Vatican in gray clouds. Behind the towering walls and marble pillars of St. Peter's Basilica, a closed-door meeting was taking place inside a room known as the Sala della Sapienza, the Hall of Wisdom. 8 senior priests from across the globe sat around an ancient round table that had witnessed centuries of theological debate. These weren't ordinary priests. They were renowned scholars, spiritual advisors, and professors of theology in the Catholic Church. Among them was Father Matteo Romano, a theologian from Italy, well known for his progressive thoughts and deep studies of Abrahamic religions. That day's topic was universal truth and interfaith dialogue. But Matteo, with calm eyes and a deep voice, posed a question that stunned the room. Why have we never truly studied the teachings of Muhammad, even though we mention his name in every interfaith dialogue? Surprise. A few priests exchanged glances. The name of Prophet Muhammad wasn't taboo, but it was rarely explored beyond symbolic tolerance. But Matteo continued, undeterred. I've read parts of the Quran, and honestly I was shaken, not by dogma but by its depth. Are we willing to open our hearts, not as theologians, but as seekers of truth? Silence. Then, slowly, nods began to appear. None of them knew that this decision would change the course of their lives forever. That night, after the meeting ended, they gathered at Father Matteo's private residence in the Trastevere district of Rome. Matteo opened a small wooden box. Inside were copies of the Quran in various languages: Arabic, Latin, English, Spanish, even Polish. I've collected them quietly over the years, Matteo said with a faint smile. Not to refute them, but to understand. That night they read together Surah Al-Fatiha, Surah Maryam, Surah Al-Baqarah. They didn't just read, they listened with their hearts. And for the first time, the room that was once filled with quotations from popes and church fathers was now filled with the verses of the Quran, which felt strangely calming to their souls. They didn't know what to call this journey yet. They didn't say guidance or conversion. But that night, amidst stacks of books and cups of cooling coffee, 8 lanterns began to glow quietly in the dark. The bells of Notre Dame de Victoires in Paris echoed softly in Father Jean-Luc's mind. It had been over a week since the clandestine meeting in the Vatican, yet his heart remained restless. The verses they had read that night, about Maryam, about Isa, about the one true God, haunted him not with fear, but with an unfamiliar pull, a strange peace. Far away in Nigeria, Father Emmanuel, a formerly rigid critic of non-Christian faiths, was having his own reckoning. That week he had a dream. A man glowing with soft light called out to him gently. Emmanuel, the man said, you know your heart has not yet reached its end. He woke up drenched in sweat, his chest heaving, his mind shaken. Unbeknownst to each other, all 8 priests were experiencing the same internal turbulence. Something had begun to stir, slow, steady, but undeniable. One afternoon in Rome, Father Matteo sent them a message. Meet at the usual place. There's someone you must hear. He hasn't come to convert you, but to explain. Come with your heart open. They gathered once more at the modest house in Trastevere, the place where their journey had quietly begun. This time, Matteo wasn't alone. With him stood a man dressed in a white turban and flowing robe, calm-faced and dignified. His name was Dr. Ahmad Al-Fadhil, an Islamic scholar and professor of theology from Al-Azhar University, now teaching in Leiden. Assalamu alaikum, he greeted gently. Some looked down, others offered faint nods. Dr. Ahmad simply smiled and began to speak, not with harsh words or fiery debates, but with stories that pierced straight to the soul. He spoke of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, a man who responded to hatred with mercy, who forgave those who persecuted him, who spent long nights in prayer, not for himself, but out of love and gratitude to his Creator. He explained how Islam was not just a religion, but a way of life that honored dignity, justice, and peace. Questions poured in about the Trinity, about Jesus, about the Bible, about salvation. Dr. Ahmad did not argue. He clarified. He did not condemn. He invited. His tone was never overbearing, only deeply sincere. Then he recited a verse in Arabic, his voice deep and beautiful. Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth. The example of his light is like a niche within which is a lamp. Quran 2400 hours 35. Tears welled up in the eyes of the listeners, not because they felt defeated, but because they felt seen, understood, and deeply moved. They were theologians trained to dissect belief with logic. But this could only be felt. That night, none of them said the word conversion. No one brought it up. But they all knew something had shifted. Their hearts no longer fully belonged to the church. A light had crept in, subtle but steady, and it was not going away. That night, a cool spring breeze swept quietly through the outskirts of Rome. In a modest house tucked away from the city's noise, not a church, not a mosque, just an ordinary home. 8 men sat in a silent circle. They were no longer priests in the eyes of the world. They were souls weary of searching, yet finally unwilling to turn away from the light they had found. Father Matteo, now known among them as Harun, breathed deeply. Tonight was not just another study session. It was the night they would cross a threshold. It was the night of Shahada. Dr. Ahmad al-Fadhil stood before them, his face serene and eyes glowing with a quiet joy. In his hands, he held a small sheet of paper containing the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith, transliterated into 8 different languages: Italian, French, Spanish, Polish, German, Portuguese, English, and Latin. But none of them needed the translation anymore. He looked at each of them in silence. There was trembling in their bodies, tears in their eyes, but conviction in their hearts. They had sacrificed much: status, stability, perhaps family, and their place in the world. But what they stood to gain now was far greater. Harun stepped forward first, voice unsteady but heart resolute. Ashhadu alla ilaha illallah, wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. A moment of absolute silence fell. Then tears, quiet sobs filled the room, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming peace of surrendering to truth. One by one, the others followed. Jean-Luc, with his thick French accent, shaking yet smiling. Emmanuel, tears streaming down his dark cheeks, reciting each word like it was etched in his soul. Gregor, the once skeptical German, dropped to his knees in sujud as soon as he finished. Luis, the Spaniard, embraced Harun tightly after saying the final word. Tomasz, the Polish priest, gently laid his cross on the table and whispered the words with eyes closed. Patrick, the Irishman, gazed at the ceiling and whispered, "I've finally come home." And Carlos, from Brazil, smiled and said, "I feel like I've been born again." No applause, no ceremony, just raw, honest submission to God. They embraced, not as former priests, not as converts, but as brothers. Harun took out a prayer rug and unrolled it on the floor. "This is not the end," he said, smiling through tears. "It's the most beautiful beginning." Together, they prayed Maghrib for the first time. Their movements were hesitant, their recitation imperfect, but their hearts were full. For the first time, they bowed to their Lord with no barriers, no intermediaries, only sincerity. Outside, the Roman night sky seemed clearer than usual. It was as if even the stars were bearing witness that night. 8 lanterns had been lit, quietly, permanently. That morning, the air in Rome felt heavier than usual. At the front of Santa Maria della Pace Church, hundreds of parishioners gathered, preparing for Massachusetts. They arrived as they always did, dressed in their finest clothes, Bibles in hand, ready to follow the familiar rhythm of the service led by Father Matteo. But they did not know that today Mass would not be the same. Inside the altar room, Matteo, now Haroun, stood behind the curtains, gazing at the cross that hung on the wall in front of him. He had loved this place once. For more than 2 decades, he had stood at this pulpit, preaching with zeal, counseling, marrying couples, baptizing children, even presiding over the funerals of the deceased. But today it was different. Today he was not Father Matteo. He was now a Muslim, and he had come to speak the truth no matter the cost. His heart raced with anticipation, but his mind was calm. In his hands, he held a piece of paper, words he had written the night before, words that carried a lifetime of reflection, fear, and longing. He stepped onto the pulpit. The congregation fell silent. Some smiled, a few waved to him. He raised his hand to ask for their attention and said, "My beloved brothers and sisters, today I do not come to preach as usual. I come to speak a truth that I have kept hidden for far too long, because I was afraid. But I can no longer live in the shadows." The church fell into a hushed stillness. Some parishioners exchanged uneasy glances. Haroun continued, "I have studied something deeply over the past months. I have read the Quran. I have studied the life of Muhammad, and I have spoken with an open heart. I did not seek error, but I sought light, and I have found it. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then, like an invisible wave, the silence broke into murmurs. I, Matteo Romano, stand before you today to declare that I have chosen Islam as my way of life. I am a Muslim," gasped, eyes wide open. One woman dropped her purse. A young man stood up, shouting, "Traitor!" But, unexpectedly, a few in the congregation began to clap, softly, quietly, but enough to make the entire room freeze in disbelief. Among those clapping was Maria, a young mother who had been helped by Haroun after the death of her husband. "If he speaks from his heart, let him stand with honesty," she said, her voice trembling. The next day, the news of a senior Vatican priest converting to Islam spread across the globe. International media outlets covered the story. Some called it a betrayal of faith, while others hailed it as a return to truth. But what they didn't know was that Haroun was not alone. In the following weeks, each of the 7 other priests began to announce their conversion to Islam in their respective countries, each doing so in their own way, facing intense consequences, but with hearts that were resolute and light. In France, Jean-Luc lost his position. In Poland, Tomasz was excommunicated. In Nigeria, Emmanuel faced threats from extremist groups, but none of them wavered. Instead, the tide began to change. Dozens of people embraced Islam after hearing their stories, not out of pressure, but because they saw something that had been missing for so long: courage to speak the truth, no matter the consequences. A year later, the 8 men stood together in the vast courtyard of Masjid al-Haram. They wore the ihram, ready for Hajj. They were no longer priests. They were now brothers. They no longer stood behind pulpits, but before the mihrab, a symbol of their renewed devotion. "We may have lost the world," said Haroun, his voice soft but firm, "but we have gained the heavens." And those 8 lanterns continued to shine, not for themselves, but for all those still wandering in the dark, searching for their way home.